I'm Dave Hill. I'm the publisher and editor of onlondon.co.uk. This podcast will address a very large question. Is Labour in big trouble in London? And if so, does it care? Now, to address that big question, my guest today is Christabel Cooper. She is Director of Research at think tank Labour Together. She used to be a Labour councillor in Hammersmith and Fulham, and she knows an awful lot about voters and elections and opinion polls. So Christabel, welcome. What answers do you have to my very large question, please?
Well, great to be here, Dave. Yes, Labour does need to care about what happens to it in London. In the last election, Labour won 59 out of the 75 seats in London. And I'm sure many of your listeners will have been looking anxiously at some of the opinion polls and electoral models that are frequently being published at the moment that have Labour collapsing in some cases to sort of maybe around about 150 odd seats. But what's really interesting about some of those models, and I was just looking at the latest YouGov one, is that Labour only loses 6 seats in London. So out of those 144 that YouGov predict, 53 of those Labour-held seats would be in London. So if Labour loses London, it really is in very, very serious trouble. So absolutely, in answer to your question, Labour very much does need to care about London.
Right, but it sounds from what you've just said about that poll that although they may be in some trouble in London, they're not actually in that much trouble necessarily.
I mean, obviously, polls are not necessarily predictions of the future. And certainly, I think Labour's electoral strategy at the moment is rather relying on the fact that in a general election where we assume we will be facing reform as our main threat, that progressive voters who might be a little unhappy with Labour at the moment will in the end, when faced with the prospect of Nigel Farage entering number 10, think, actually, I know who I've got to vote for. So I think that there is some element of that in it. I mean, I think what's going to be incredibly interesting is what happens in the local elections coming up next year, because they're often a very different kettle of fish. And we know in the past that when you've got, in fact, the worst possible time to be a councillor is if you're of the party of an incumbent government that is not terribly popular, because rightly, wrongly, people regard local elections as a bit of a free hit to kick the government. So I think you will find in those elections, actually, that will paint a very, very different picture to some of those electoral models. And of course, you know, like I say, we're 3.5, 4 years away from an election. We don't really know, and voters are more volatile than they ever have been. It's I guess to kind of quote the models that I did was more to sort of highlight that if Labour does lose those votes, just how much trouble it really then is in.
Okay. We have a mutual friend, Lewis Baston, who writes fantastic analysis pieces for me about local council by-elections in London. And he's sent me a very useful summary of what has been happening, sort of larger trends of what has been happening in those London borough by-elections since the general election. And initially, I think, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting his view here, initially I think he felt that although Labour was losing some vote share in those by-elections, it was at a sort of level that you would kind of expect, because people tend to, a party gets elected to national government and then immediately starts losing smaller elections all over the country or losing share. But it was sort of at the level that you might expect. But more recently, quarter by quarter, Labour has been sort of losing sort of around 15% vote share. Reform has been picking up in percentage terms quite a lot. And that's not quite the same thing as actual votes, of course. And Labour, I think we've seen opinion polls showing that Labour is still by some distance the most popular party for Londoners. Even so, if it could lose quite a lot of seats next May. I know predicting these is a mug's game, but I come back to my initial point. Does Labour nationally really care what happens to London? Is there a sense in which it feels it can take the capital for granted?
Well, I certainly hope not, and I genuinely don't think that the party does. I mean, I thought it was quite interesting. There was a speech just before the conference, the Labour Party conference speech that Keir Starmer gave at an international conference in London a couple of days earlier. And it was the first time that he'd actually come out and challenged some of the ludicrous stuff that's coming out of the populist right about London. He sort of invited all the international guests to kind of look outside and, is there this sort of dystopian anarchy that that sometimes London is portrayed as being, and so it was good to actually hear him take on some of that, because it is very, very frustrating for those of us that live in London, that love London, to hear this city. I mean, it's almost quite bizarre, described in a way that is literally just bears no relationship to reality. And of course, anyone that has been here knows that that's not true. But I mean, I guess the audience for some of that are people who don't live in London, who very rarely visit London. And I think that they do get the impression that that is correct. So it was very good to hear Keir Starmer actually stand up at a national, as a national leader, as opposed to just kind of relying on the Mayor of London to do it all the time, to say, actually, no, London is a successful and prosperous city.
I agree with you, and I enjoyed that moment too, because I think it might have been a couple of days after Donald Trump had said something rude, as he habitually does. But even so, in the conference speech that Keir Starmer gave, a speech which I thought had quite a lot of good things going for it, he talked a lot about the politics of grievance and what a bad thing that is, and then he immediately indulged in one form of politics of grievance, which is what I call the Northern Grievance Chorus, led by Andy Burnham, making this point about, and yes, it's a very good thing that we are investing in transport infrastructure outside of London and the South East. Hurrah, said the crowd. And when Rachel Reeves...
the crowd in Liverpool.
yeah, well, okay. And when Rachel Reeves made her big infrastructure, her big spending review speech, she also sort of went out of her way to say, I agree with all those people all those politicians in the north of England who've been saying that the Treasury Green Book discriminates against them and it's not fair and so on. And I thought, well, actually, there are a few people who've had a look at that Treasury Green Book and addressed that question, and they don't think it discriminates against in favour of London. So why are they doing that kind of thing, do you think, Christabel?
So we do know that the UK is one of the most geographically unequal countries in the developing world. And I guess as a party that is essentially dedicated to creating a fairer and more equal society, it's not surprising that Labour would therefore want to speak about that kind of regional inequality. Now, I think there are different ways of doing that. And I think, there are very long-standing reasons why London and the Greater South East is wealthier, is more productive than some other parts of the country. And of course, as you know very, very well, the idea that just because, median wages and median house prices in London are very high does not mean that there is not huge inequality within the city. There are high levels of child poverty, as you know, from when you walk down the street. There are huge numbers of people sleeping out on the street because, there is a housing crisis in this city. But nevertheless, I think the fact is that level of inequality has not benefited London either. Billions of pounds worth of taxes go out of London to the rest of the country. And if other places were as productive as London, then perhaps some of that money could stay within the city and address some of the problems that we have here. And, and the demand for housing, the fact that lots of people feel that they can't stay where they are in order to get a decent job and have to come down to London, just exacerbates the housing crisis. It means that, housing is becoming practically hereditary. The only way that you can afford to live live in London is if your parents owned property in London, which is not the sort of city that I think that we really want to live in. So I think that to point out that there are regional inequalities and to seek to address them is a pretty reasonable thing for Labour to do. I do think, and here I agree with you, I think there are some politicians, and I'm not going to name any of them, but I think there are some people who use very pejorative language, who sort of somehow suggest that there has been this kind of deliberate favouritism towards London, which I'm not. There are long-standing structural reasons why we have ended up as we have. That I don't think you kind of need that sort of pejorative language to address. But I do think that there is a problem of lack of investment outside London. And in fact, I would point your listeners to an excellent report that the think tank I work for, Labour Together, produced a few weeks ago called London Unchained, which suggested some ways in which London could actually raise its own money to invest in. So it was specifically using the example of the Bakerloo line extension, this sort of ongoing saga that kind of never gets resolved. And suggested that, in fact, if the mayor could force boroughs to simply, build more houses using revenue for that, to fund the Bakerloo line extension without any need for government investment. And I mean, as we know, many infrastructure projects in London, a huge amount of money does come from private investment. So it's just a kind of shift to making more of it come from private investment.
I saw and read and indeed wrote about that very interesting paper, and I certainly take the point that other parts of the other regions, other city regions, let's call them that, should be helped and supported to become more successful, more productive, because I think everybody accepts, and I certainly do, that the super concentration of productivity in the capital city is a bad thing for the country. It's not a good situation. The worst thing about it, perhaps, is that so many ambitious and adventurous young people from other parts of England and Britain as a whole, including from other fine English cities, come to London because it's the only place where they think they can get to do the things that they want to do, and that is not a good state of affairs. But my gripe, if you like, is that we're in a kind of chicken and egg situation here, because just because Boris Johnson used to say this, it doesn't mean it isn't true. If London isn't doing well, that enormous tax export that you referred to just now doesn't happen, and of course that's the money that we'll pay for new rail infrastructure in Manchester and so on. And so if you weaken London, everybody else is damaged by it. So you have to find a way, I think, of keeping London strong and then investing, in the right ways and in the most effective ways in other cities. If we're going to start to change that situation. So why can't a Labour government that's committed to national renewal embrace the capital city in that great project, rather than giving the impression, and Sadiq Khan has made this point himself, of trying to sort of curry favour in the north of England and parts of the Midlands by sort of agreeing with people that, it's not fair that London gets more than its fair share and so on. I mean, I've got a point there, haven't I? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I entirely, I can't say I disagree with any of that. And I think that the portrayal of London versus the rest of the country as a zero-sum game is really, really destructive. I mean, and I think that what the kind of populists of both left and right want to argue is always that there is this sort of zero-sum situation that we're in, that somebody has to lose in order for another group to win. And I do think that we need to be really pushing back on that, because in all sorts of ways, it is just not true that, London has to suffer in order that Manchester does well. It is not true that graduates have to suffer in order for non-graduates to do well. It is actually the case that as a country, we should be taking contributions from everyone and using them for the common good, rather than just saying, well, we can only get this if somebody else is done down. I mean, I think, that's kind of the sadness of the times that we are living at. And I think that is in a way what Keir was trying to get at, I think, with the politics of grievance. But people feel so, I think, pessimistic and so, we just had crisis after crisis over the last 10 years. And I think people are sort of losing faith in the ability of politicians to actually make their lives better. And it is a very seductive story by whoever it is saying this, that, well, the reason that you are doing badly is because these people over here have unfairly taken something from you. And I mean, and it's just, it's almost all of those stories are untrue and eventually unravel in the end, but often by the time it's too late. And I absolutely agree with you. I think we really need to avoid that kind of story or narrative with regard to sort of regional inequality.
Okay, well, I'm very, very glad that you absolutely agree with me. It means that I'm going to ask you back another time. But I'd like to... I'm going to end by asking you a question which I have a feeling you're not going to answer, and for very good reasons. As you look ahead to 6 or 7 months to the borough elections next May in London, what do you think is going to happen?
In one word, chaos. So, I mean, you see this not just in London, but in some of these election models that I was referencing earlier. We really are facing this absolutely unprecedented situation where the two main parties, well, former main parties, are getting, between them in the opinion polls, less than 40% of the vote. And sort of votes are just going in all directions. Labour is currently, is holding on to maybe about 50% of its vote. But that vote is going, most of it is going in the direction of the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. Lots of it is going to people who just don't know and probably in local elections just simply won't turn out. Some of it is going to Reform. Tiny bit is even going to the Conservatives. But basically, first past the post is just not a system that is designed to deal with having quite a few parties on a similar share of the vote. It's supposed to just have two parties that are kind of getting well over 30% of the vote, and then you kind of get very clear outcomes. So I think, especially in council elections, when people are going to be more inclined to vote for third parties anyway, because rightly or wrongly they feel that they can kind of get away with doing that. These are, again, sadly tend to be low turnout elections compared to a general election. I think it just becomes almost impossible. And of course, we know that sort of individual wards can be won by literally a handful of vote. One family turns out and they will change the result of that election. Yeah,
I think chaos So chaos is a very good word, I think. Certainly looks that way to me, but it'll make it fun for people like us. Now I'm going to leave you with one thought, which is the thought of a mutual friend who I probably better hadn't named, but he has been known to remark that the best way to get the Labour government to give you money and pay attention to you is to vote for other people. So maybe in terms of London being looked upon favourably by the Labour government next spring, everybody should go and vote for other parties. What do you think?
Well, obviously, everyone should go and vote for the Labour Party because it is, the alternatives are grim, and I think it is the only party that has any kind of semblance of a plan that actually might make the country better. But basically, your point about sort of voting for other people is just the essence of democracy. I mean, this is why democracy is a better system than others. That it does allow people to tell the governing party that they are unhappy and ask them to do something about it. So whilst obviously I would only ever encourage people to vote Labour, I think even more than that, I would encourage people to vote and to because if you don't vote, then politicians don't have to take account of of what you want and what your particular needs are. So
Okay.
what I would definitely urge everyone to do in the May elections is to go and make your voice heard.
Okay, well, on that stirring, virtuous and uplifting note, Christabel, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you everybody for watching and listening. Goodbye.